Hi, welcome back to The Hatch. I'm Sammy Roth.
And I'm Rosie Murphy. This is the podcast where we talk about Lost.
This week we're watching In Translation. It is the 17th episode of the first season. It's an episode about Jin. We've got more from our interview with the writer Leonard Dick, who wrote this episode, so you'll definitely want to stick around and hear that.
Let's get started.
As always, we're going to start with hot takes. Rosie, what is your hot take about In Translation?
So, this is the episode where we really see the beginning of the Sayid-Shannon romance, which
Oh boy.
never fully made sense to me. I'm not totally on board with it. I'm not totally convinced by it. I also have a big problem with near the end of the episode when Shannon approaches Sayid and says, having talked to Locke, everyone gets a new life on this island. I'd like to start now. Like, Shannon's whole life thus far has been structured around, like, her relationships with powerful men, or men who have more power than she does, at least. And if her new life is also structured around a relationship with a powerful man, then it's not a new life. It's the same thing she's been doing the whole time. That's my hot take.
That's a very good point. That is. I have nothing to... You're right. I do want to add that, as much as I am not a fan of Shannon and Sayid, I was a little bit disappointed in Sayid that he was so interested in Shannon, and then Boone says to him, I think she's using you, man, and he immediately, gives up. That did not seem very Sayid-like.
The thing about that is that, Boone is kind of right. His assessment is harsh, but it's not wrong.
No, you're right. It's not. I was surprised that Sayid just immediately took it at face value and didn't think, I can handle this. I was a little surprised.
Well, I mean, Boone basically said to him, hey, man, she's just using you. And Sayid, doesn't know Shannon particularly well. And, Boone knows her much better. And Sayid also doesn't really know anything about their personal past. So I think it makes sense that he would set a lot of store by what Boone says.
That's fair.
Yeah. But anyway, I'm willing to be convinced by the Shannon-Sayid relationship, but I am not there yet. Perhaps soon.
Nor am I. But anyway, I've got a hot take as well.
Sure.
Which is just that out of all of the sort of difficult to watch and emotional for good and bad reason stuff this episode, I was just so broken by the scene with the Secretary of the Environment, where when he realizes Jin is not going to kill him the first time, he's so grateful. He just starts groveling, and he can't help himself,
right.
and he takes his daughter's dog and gives it over to Jin as a token of gratitude. It's just, I don't know, it's just, I feel so bad for the guy that he's, supposedly this high-ranking government official, and yet this is what he's reduced to because a powerful businessman has chosen to spare his life in this moment. It really got to me.
Right. Well, and the powerful businessman didn't choose to spare his life. Jin just didn't know what he was supposed to do.
Right.
And Jin is really confused in that scene. You can see him not understanding why the minister is reacting with such overwhelming emotion. Because he was told to deliver a message, and so he goes and speaks the words and then leaves. And throughout the flashback, Jin sort of starts to realize the gravity of the job he's taken on, and you can see this progression from, okay, great, I'm working for Sun's dad, to, oh shit, this is more than I expected, to, oh shit, in order to save this man's life, I actually have to beat him half to death. It really gets pretty extreme pretty quickly, and Jin doesn't really realize what he's gotten into until quite a bit later, I think.
Right, he's way over his head before he figures it out.
Yeah.
And just, since we're going to be talking about Jin and Sun anyway, I think that's a good transition off of the hot take. That there's that scene later in the episode with his dad, which is a remarkable scene, I think. And his dad it has such an uplifting message, it is a good world, you can break free of this. And I thought it was interesting that Jin's commentary there was, look, there's nothing I can do about this, I have these obligations, these commitments.
And his dad says, no, you don't.
Yeah. Right?
Yeah, which is true. But Jin at this point is such, not just sort of a slave to Sun's father, but a slave to what he expects of himself. that he can't even get outside
exactly.
that framework in his own head.
Right, and as you see him slip into, what he thinks Sun's father expects of him, or what he knows Sun's father expects of him, it just, that scene with his dad makes you realize, like, oh, this whole time as he was getting in over his head, he had a choice to back out.
Right.
I mean, he didn't actually have to do any of those things. He made a choice that, this is the route I have taken, and I have to do this to be with Sun, and his dad just totally, blows the roof off of that and says, no, you don't. Mm-hmm. It's kind of great.
Yeah.
So we kind of have already moved away from the hot take section here, but before we move too far away, we do have a hot take from a listener, so let's give that a listen.
This is friend of the show, Nick, who you may remember from his thoughts about Rousseau. Here he is.
As I was watching the episode, I was thinking about why Jin and Michael, why are they the two central characters in the episode? And obviously both of them have a relationship with Sun, but I think there's more to it than just that. I think there's a lot of parallels between basically the problems in their lives at this point. And for both of them, it's because they started off doing something as a means to be with the ones they love, but then it becomes the end in itself. So in the case of Michael, he wants to get off the island originally to be with his son, but it becomes an overwhelming goal, such an overwhelming goal that he loses sight of what his son wants and what would be best for their relationship. And you see this most clearly in the conversation about New York, where he keeps saying, I want to get you to New York. You're going to love New York. And Walt is like, I don't know about New York, right? The means has become the end in itself. And for Jin, he joins the corporation as a means to being with Sun and being with her always. But then again, it becomes the end in itself, to the point where he can no longer talk to her and no longer spend time with her. And so I think basically they have the same problem, which is, even though they think they're doing something on behalf of the person they love, they lose sight of that person and sort of become disconnected and confuse means and ends.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of insight in that. You hear Jin saying, I'm doing all this for Sun, I'm doing this so we can be together. And in reality, they're not together. Like, they're so emotionally distant that you get to this end where they were both going to be on the same flight, and Sun was going to leave Jin, and Jin was going to leave her father, and they had these totally different goals, but there was nothing, like, there was no communication left in their relationship at all. And in the same way with Michael, you get, and we've talked a lot about Michael and how he doesn't really know how to be a parent, and his heart might be in the right place, but he really doesn't know how to express that or how to incorporate Walt's wants and needs into his own life. But I think there is definitely a parallel there.
Yeah, and at first it seems like Michael is doing this, but Walt doesn't really want to leave the island. I mean, that's why Walt burns the raft. He tells Locke at the end, I'm tired of moving. What my dad wants isn't really what I want. But then Walt kind of changes by the end, and after having gone through the burning of the raft and seeing how everyone reacts, he seemed, right. And in fact, you see at first after, when the raft is burning, Walt looks like he has this moment of regret where he runs up and starts trying to throw sand on it and put out the fire. And then at the end he goes to Michael and says, if you're going to build a new one, I want to help. Right. And so I thought that was interesting, and I wonder what's going on in Walt's head there, that he has this turnaround. It just seems like burning the hatch is like this experience for him that changes the way he looks at his dad a little bit.
Yeah. Anyway, yes, back to Jin and Sun.
Where were we?
So one of the things, like, just structurally about this episode that I think is brilliant is the design, the writers and producers' choice of when to use subtitles and when not to. So when we're in the flashbacks and everyone's understanding one another, we get subtitles. And this is, an American audience, probably majority English-speaking audience, who is able to understand what's happening in the flashback because everyone can understand each other. But when you have on the beach, the mob sort of accusing Jin of burning the raft, you just have him shouting and there are no subtitles. And you have no idea what he's saying unless you speak Korean. And that really replicates for the viewer, I think, the experience on the island you can tell he wants to communicate, but like the crowd on the beach, you have no idea what he's saying. Or I had no idea what he's saying.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does, and I mean, you're right. I think they're definitely going out of their way to emphasize how disorienting that all is. Like, there's this, for Jin, like there's this scene where you sort of see everyone from Jin's perspective after Sawyer has dragged him onto the beach, and it's like kind of shifting and hazy, and the words are all garbled, and it's very striking.
Mm-hmm. We obviously have to talk about the scene at the end of this episode where they're at the caves and Jin is packing up his stuff and Sun is imploring him, like, we don't talk anymore. When did we stop talking? Just tell me what you're thinking. And Jin is totally silent, and Sun finally shouts at him, but she shouts in English, I was going to leave you.
I was going to leave you. I was going to get away. But you made me change my mind.
So I asked Leonard Dick, the writer, about this moment later on. So you'll hear what his sort of reasoning for that was. I guess my interpretation of it was she felt like she so badly needed to get that off her chest, but she still sort of couldn't bring herself to let Jin know that, like even at this lowest of low moments. That's sort of what it seemed like. But I think there's also a way to read it as that somehow, even though it's in English, he understands what she's saying and still chooses to, turn around and walk away.
Well, and then she says, why can we go back to the beginning? And he just says, it's too late. And he walks away, which is incredibly sad.
Right, and not where, at least for me, not where I expected this episode to go at all, with the flashback that built up to it, where you find out that Jin wanted to get that new beginning. Yeah. And not to mention that this is just the first time when we finally really see behind this this hardened person that Jin has become, and see how tender he and Sun once were, and see that he really didn't mean to go down this path and become this kind of person. And so you get all of this, finally it's like, okay, I can sympathize with Jin. He's really a good guy deep down. They'll figure this out somehow, and then it's this stunner ending of we can't. It's very harsh.
Well, and then it sets up an arc that lasts the length of the series, which is their attempts to reconcile with one another.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, their attempts to just physically be with one another. Because I almost see a parallel here where it seems like Jin thinks that he deserves what's happening to him in a similar way that we get with Sawyer and Christian Shepherd last week, where they both feel like...
Yeah, some people are meant to suffer.
I guess I'm thinking again about the scene with Jin and his father, where Jin feels like he has to continue in this horrible situation, and his father's message is, well, no, you don't. You have a choice not to. And I see parallels with that to last week, where as we discussed, Sawyer and Christian Shepherd and Charlie, for instance, all could have made decisions to improve their lives and not just thought this is the lot that they've been given.
Right, but if they had a Jin's dad to tell them that the world is good. Instead, Sawyer and Christian Shepherd just reinforce one another. It's a much more selfish outlook where Christian says, "Will this ease your suffering? Then go do it."
And Jin's dad's message is, if your wife is the most important thing to you, go prioritize her.
Right.
Should we all be lucky enough to have a Jin's dad in our lives to remind us the world is good?
Yeah, my note to myself about Jin's dad is a little explicit, but it just says, Jin's dad is a fucking beacon of hope and light, which I stand by.
Honestly, I think in 2017 this scene holds up even better than in 2004. I mean, my God, that's a scene that we all need. Right.
I'm very excited to share the next part of the show with you, which is a conversation with Leonard Dick, specifically about In Translation, which he wrote. He and Sammy will talk about dramatic irony. They'll talk about a lot of the scenes that we discussed today. It's a great piece of tape.
So you said the first thing, and when I first reached out to you, you said the first thing you pitched on your first episode that you wrote In Translation was that Jin entering the room in the flashback with blood on his hands, that there was a different explanation for that, or that it wasn't what you thought it was. I'm curious. Yeah, I'm just curious why you decided to jump in with that, and what was your thinking, and that was what you had to start by doing.
What I loved about Lost was at every turn, just when you think it's going to happen, it's something completely unexpected. And the show was just a master of making these very cool left turns. I mean, none more so evident than the episode Walkabout, where you reveal that Locke is actually in a wheelchair.
Sure.
And so I knew when I came in, I knew that the idea here was to pay off what had been set up in the Sun episode earlier in the season, House of the Rising Sun, and there was the mystery, of course, of what had Jin done. And so, consistent with the tone of the show and these left turns, I said, what if it's not what you think it is? The audience is expecting that Jin did something bad. I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if Jin actually did something good? And it was a mercy beating, that he in effect saved somebody's life. And so the group took that, Damon and Carlton took that, and we worked on it together, and we turned it into the story. But the starting point was that when Jin comes in, we've been waiting for 5, 6, 7 episodes to find what's the bad thing Jin did, and the truth is it wasn't quote unquote bad, it was quote unquote good, but still it still had that gray morality to it that he really does beat the guy, but he does it to save his life. And so it was just a way. So the idea behind the initial pitch was to do something consistent with what the show had become in those first 12, 13 episodes or so.
Yeah, that is interesting, because you're right that it is. I mean, I was just rewatching this episode, and it still feels very gray. That scene where he goes in and Sun asks him, "What is it you do to my father?" and he says, "I do whatever your father asks me." I mean, it's so dark. It's tough to watch.
It is. Jin and Sun, as with all the characters, end up being these very textured, complex characters, and it was interesting at every turn to try to show a new layer. And so this episode, especially in the first season when we're still introducing the characters to the audience, you have a chance to show the depth and the surprises, and you see that Jin, this hard ass who's been really mistreating Sun on the island, is really a broken soul. And so though this episode was a chance really to show Jin's depth, and that there was a soul in there, and that it really is a tortured soul.
Yeah, and that's another thing that definitely struck me watching the episode, that you do see so many different versions of Jin, because you see the hard ass, you see the guy who's forced to do terrible things. You also see that really tender moment at the beginning of the flashback where it's on their wedding day and he's buttoning up her dress. How do you approach that as a writer of showing all of these very different permutations of this same character and still kind of have him hang together as a real believable person at the end of it, which you do, but I'm just curious how you strike that balance.
I think that's a testament to Damon Lindelof, Carlton Cuse, J.J. Abrams. The show that was created and the show that was delivered was you always wanted these characters to be complex and have depth. So the show worked very hard to show these layers. 1 minute you love Sawyer, the next minute you hate him. You see Jin being a hard ass to his wife, really emotionally abusive, and then you get this very nice surprise that he genuinely and deeply loves his wife. And so I think it speaks to the principles of surprising the audience, but also making sure that these characters were presented in the most complex and deep way as possible. And that's precisely what I think made these people so interesting and so compelling, and why the show was able to last as long as it did. The audience became so engaged with the characters so quickly that they stuck it out. And it was set up early. It was set up way before I joined the show, and it's what made me fall in love with the show, and it's really what sustained the show over its run.
Yeah, I'm totally with you, and definitely on rewatching it now for this podcast, I find myself just having totally different reactions to some of the characters than I did the first time, which I think speaks a lot to the the depth that you're talking about. I mean, I'm much more skeptical of Locke this time through, a lot more sympathetic to Michael than I was. Jin and Sun, I don't think I was quite as invested in their bond the first time, but really watching and paying attention to the texture, it just, it jumps out at you really strongly.
Yeah, and I think also when you watch it a second time, especially several years later, it's like seeing a. This might sound a little pretentious, but it's like when you go and look at a classic painting again, and you say, "Oh, I never noticed that the Mona Lisa's elbow was actually pointing to the left." You find the little details, these little moments that at first watch you might miss, but were really layered in there carefully. And then when you watch it, you see that the characters are actually perhaps even more complex than you thought. Mm-hmm. A lot of it goes to how people watch television shows, and it has certainly changed over the years. But most people sit on the couch. They have their eye on their phones. I think people are sort of half watching. And I think one of the great things about Lost was, at least people in my world, watch the show intently. And so even watching the show so carefully and so intently, even watching it a few years later, as you are, you're still picking up things that you may have missed the first go around, or you see a scene that you remembered and now you see it in a different light, knowing that what Jin did, for example, 4 episodes earlier, or what might be coming down the pike. And so it makes for a more entertaining view. And by the way, please don't consider that a plug for buying the DVDs. But hey, if your listeners want to, go ahead, buy the DVDs and give it and rewatch it.
I am the proud owner of season 5, which is my favorite of the seasons. Bought that one on DVD. But yes, cool. You can plug it all you want. That's fine. There is a scene that I wanted to ask you about that stood out to me for that reason of something that I just didn't really pick up on the first time, that I was curious about now. It's the scene where Sun is yelling at Jin in this episode and kind of finally breaks down in the caves and asks him to start over and asks him what's going on. But she tells him, I was going to leave you at the airport, and you convinced me that you loved me and that I shouldn't. But she says that part in English. It's this whole speech that she makes in Korean, but she switches into English where she tells him, I was going to leave you and you changed my mind. And I was just, it made me wonder, like, oh, is she saying that in English because she doesn't actually want him to know that? Does he never learn that information?
I believe that was the intent, because there's the great moment where she speaks in English and he doesn't understand it. And so it becomes this interesting way to make a confession, taking a little bit from our high school, what we learned, our high school lessons in Shakespeare about dramatic irony, is the audience now knows what the character doesn't. And you get to hear this heartfelt, really tortured confession that he'll never understand. And so the audience knows now how deeply it runs and how deeply the pain runs for Sun. And you now look at Jin, actually, and Sun too, very differently from that point on. And you can see just how much this difficult relationship has ripped at her, and so it culminates with that heartfelt confession, which is, again, it's your high school case of dramatic irony, which I think played so well because we had 2 phenomenal actors doing that scene.
Did you have an expectation when you were writing for Jin and Sun at this point early in the show that they would get that happy ending, that they ultimate sort of happy ending, that they would end up together, that things would work out for them?
Yeah, there was. I think it was in the cards that they would reconcile and things would be good. But you don't want to. You don't want to pay it off too early. You want to sustain it and find twists in the story and turns here and there. But there was, the Jin Sun relationship was one that was identified early on and mapped out pretty clearly. And so it ended in a point where where we thought it would, and knowing also that the raft, something was going to happen to the raft, and that Jin would be returning to the island. And then what does that mean for the relationship going forward, and how does it change?
So that's interesting. So you had it pretty early on. That was the plan, that the raft was going to run into trouble. Yeah,
the season there, the headlines. It's interesting. There's a metaphor that was actually Carlton who said it once that I've always thought was very insightful, and I've actually used it on other shows, which is when shows start their planning and think about what they want to do, is we knew we were driving from New York to Los Angeles. It's just, and then we knew we'd have to get to a certain city on this date, a certain city on that date, and a certain city on that date, and then we'd be in Los Angeles on December 10th or whatever it is. But the question is, week to week, are we going to the Grand Canyon or are we stopping in Las Vegas? And so that's a fancy way of saying we knew that by episode 10, X would happen, by episode 15, Y would happen, and by the finale, that raft was going to sail, that they were going to open that hatch, etc. Like those are the big ones. And then along the way, it's you find week to week. Okay, what is the story we want to tell this week? Well, maybe we haven't spent time with Claire. Let's tell a little bit more of her story. So the roadmap. You know where you're going. It's well thought out. And so we knew that the raft was going to sail, and that we wanted to find, and we wanted the characters to have to return to the island. And then the question was, how can we do it in the most creative way? What are the surprises? What are sort of unexpected twists? And how does that complicate things going forward into the next season?
So I have a couple So, I mean, obviously you came up with a very creative way, which is that the others show up and blow up the raft, which is a great moment on the show. Unfortunate for Michael and company.
Yes.
A couple of raft-related questions. I was really interested to see the very beginnings of the Michael and Jin friendship at the end of this episode.
Yes.
Where Jin goes, where did that idea come from? Because it was sort of so unexpected and works out so interestingly.
The idea came from Carlton and Damon, and the idea, of course, was we've seen for X number of episodes these two at loggerheads, and so how do you advance the relationship? What's new? What's unexpected? And so to see that kind of détente, it places a nice surprise. It also feels natural to the evolution of the relationship, but also going forward, again, as part of the thinking ahead and the planning, is we wanted them on the raft. So for them to be on the raft, working on the raft together, you wanted to, it would be impossible for them to be two gladiators who are just going to kill each other. So the idea was to start to lay the groundwork to set up what was going to be coming down the pike with the season finale.
And why Sawyer? Why does Sawyer get a spot?
It was that stemmed really from the Jack Kate Sawyer relationship. Sawyer, again, everything is organic to the characters and the relationships, and Sawyer sees that Kate belongs to Jack, and so that he's also somewhat of a pariah on the island, and so Sawyer, the lone wolf, decides it's time for him to go. He doesn't belong here. He'd rather take his chance on that raft and return home.
That's interesting because he seems to be relishing that role of the outsider so much. At least externally, he's always given his Lord of the Flies speeches and
But again, that goes to the complexity of the character and the performance of the actor. Josh Holloway. I for one can't think of any actor who could play that role besides Josh.
He's amazing.
He really is, and that's where you get the great textured performance. He is bravado. He is all stubborn pride, but deep down, this is somebody with a very dark past and a very tortured soul, and he is at a very fundamental level hurt and isolated, and that's what makes him human. If he were just bravado, it would make him a two-dimensional character. Feeling that hurt, seeing that depth makes him a three-dimensional character, and makes again another one that connected with the audiences.
Well, maybe one or two other things about In Translation is the Walt setting the raft on fire. It was just it's sort of a stunner to me anyway, and I'm interested in whether that came from a place of wanting to have the dramatic plot device of the rat catches fire and then you have to figure out who did it, or if it came organically from Walt of this is something we think Walt would do.
It was actually a combination of both plotting and character. If I remember correctly, I think we thought it would be very cool to have a mystery, right? Somebody has burned the raft, and which is a compelling question because everybody wants off that island, and the raft, in theory, is the hope. And so the question is, who burns the raft and why? And which is a great plot engine for an island story. The island, with the island, there's certain stories you can't do. You can't do. An old boyfriend comes back from high school days and comes from visit. We can't do. We weren't able to do a lot of stories, conventional stories that you see on other shows. So one of the nice things about the burning of the raft is the stakes are high. It's a really cool question, and it makes you start to wonder about the characters in the ensemble. And then, of course, it just fit perfectly with, everyone's going to think it was Locke, of course, because Locke is the one who is taken to the island and wants to stay. But the great surprise is that it's Walt. And so starting out, we raised the question, at least when we were working on the story, we raised the question and we knew the answer right away. I mean, some other shows may have thought, hey, let's go burn the raft. Well, the question is, who burnt it? Well, we'll figure it out. Right. We knew going in, we knew who it was, why it was, and what the payoff would be down the road. And again, that's a total testament to the way Carlton and Damon ran the show.
So we talked about this pretty extensively prior to the interview, but I really, really like what Leonard says here about how well this episode sort of complicates both Jin and Sun. Like, I think what this episode does so well is that it uses the language barrier to sort of expose this way that everybody on the island, and to an extent the viewers as well, like, see Jin and Sun is a little bit one-dimensional, and especially Jin, because we can't hear him. We've never heard from him. We've never heard him interact with others on the island. We have no idea what's going on in his head, and so it's really easy to view him as this, like, very flat character, and then this episode just sort of blows that all to pieces. He's very tender. He's a great husband. He's capable of killing people. He's this totally wide-ranging person and character that no one is able to see because they can't speak to him. And this episode, I mean, I know we talked a bit about the title of this episode, which is In Translation, which seems a bit, not the point of the episode, but really just, like, structurally, I think it is.
You're right. It's kind of remarkable that it's 16, 17 episodes into the season, and this is the first real, like, glimpse behind the curtain we're getting of this, main character. So yeah, I think In Translation is a little bit the point. Like, Jin is finally being translated for us, the viewer, by showing us, who he is beneath this, this kind of terrible hard shell that we've seen.
Right, because he is, I mean, basically all we've seen is that he treats Sun pretty poorly on the island, and we only get our external lens. Almost all of those shots even are not, like, personal, private conversations. They're all sort of shot through somebody else's lens. It's always somebody else observing. Right. Jin telling Sun to cover up or whatever.
And either somebody who's mad at him or skeptical of him, usually.
Right, and that's the frame through which we see him too, until now, which I think is just super well done, and I'm glad we are getting to think about that this way, because I'm sure that went totally over my head the first time. I was just so captivated by the story that I wasn't really thinking about the form, but it's very, very effective.
It is. And before we close this week, I just got to say, lots of great actors on this show. Some of them get a lot of credit. Daniel Dae Kim and Yoonjin Kim don't get talked about quite so much, but they're fabulous the whole way through.
They're both fantastic.
So that's all for this week. Please come back next week. We're going to be watching Season 1, Episode 18, that is Numbers. It is the first and only Hurley episode this season, and we'll be hearing from David Fury, who wrote that episode.
As always, you can reach us on Twitter at The Hatch Podcast, Facebook.com/The Hatch Podcast. You can call and leave us a hot take at 9546-DHARMA, or by just recording your own voice and sending it as a message to our Facebook page. We will, with delight, play it and discuss it on the show.
Our cover art is by Danny Roth. Our theme music is by Andy G. Cohen. And I think that is it.
Namaste.